U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has threatened to pull out of NATO or not come to the defense of allies who don't spend enough on their militaries. Here's how NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte addressed concerns over a second Trump presidency today.
I've worked with Donald Trump for 4 years in my previous role as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and I had a very good working relationship with him. He will do everything needed to defend the United States, and he is well aware that the membership of NATO is part of the defense of the U.S.
So what could Trump's second term mean for Europe, NATO, and Russia's war in Ukraine, which Trump says he'll end in a single day? Max Bergmann is the director of Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he joins me now. Max Bergmann, good to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I think we're all expecting some pretty big changes in the U.S. approach to foreign policy. How dramatic a shift are you bracing for with the return of Donald Trump to the White House?
I think it's going to be quite dramatic. I think what happened during his first term is that Trump came into office, especially when it relates to Europe, with a number of inclinations, of feelings, of viewpoints toward NATO. He's been quite hostile towards the NATO alliance ever since really the 1980s, where he even took out an ad in one of the big New York papers against NATO. But then he met opposition in his own team by having a Secretary of Defense like General Mattis, a national security advisor like H.R. McMaster that really believe in sort of traditional American foreign policy, believe in alliances, believe in NATO. And now there's been 4 years for Trump and many of his people to think about how to implement Trump's vision, his America First vision in foreign policy. And so I think we're going to see people come in with some real plans, having put thought about how to kind of restructure the world around Trump's vision. And that's going to have serious implications for Europe and especially for Ukraine.
Okay, let's go through those. Let's start with NATO first off, because, you know, he has, I was in Brussels when he went to his first NATO meeting, and he basically said, you're all freeloaders, and I'm not going to defend you if you don't pay the 2%, which in some ways did cause an anxiety and an urgency inside the alliance to up their game. So there was a positive effect there, but then there's the question of whether he'll pull out of the alliance. We spoke with Mark Rutte today, one of my colleagues did, the new Secretary General, and he said he's not concerned about the U.S. pulling out of NATO because to keep the U.S. safe, you need a strong transatlantic alliance. Do you share the Secretary General's optimism on that?
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO. In fact, Marco Rubio, who has been looks like he's going to be nominated to be the Secretary of State, even passed legislation. It was his legislation to make it harder for the U.S. to directly pull out of NATO. But I think what we may see is a clear decline in U.S. engagement with NATO. And in fact, perhaps a redirection of resources, of U.S. forces to the Indo-Pacific, and less U.S. participation. I think the incoming Trump administration is going to be very determined to really change the paradigm of European security. And let's be clear, right now, European security is upheld by the United States, by the U.S. military's role in Europe. And I think we want to shift the burden, or the Trump administration will want to shift the burden for European security to Europeans. In some ways, that makes a lot of sense. It's quite rational. The problem is that Europe is simply not structured to do it. And they're not structured to do it because we have told the Europeans, we, the United States, for the last 25 years, 30 years since the end of the Cold War, is that we don't want the EU to be involved in security. We want European security to be dependent on us. So that's a big shift, and it will take the Europeans a lot of time to get their act together. And I think the Trump folks may go on a timeline that is just not feasible and may leave Europe very exposed.
So you're talking about troop drawdowns from the bases across Europe. I know President Biden at the NATO summit in Madrid announced an increase of U.S. presence on the eastern flank, for example, of NATO because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I know there's anxiety here amongst European diplomats that the U.S. might pull back. Is that how you see it going? Just a massive reduction of presence?
Yeah, so I think there's that. I also think there's an open question of who will be the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Maybe they don't appoint an ambassador or appoint someone that goes there to really shake things up or as a destructive force. I think it also goes deeper, though, where when the way NATO operates is that NATO asks every country, well, we expect you to contribute these forces or these capabilities. And a lot of those capabilities are provided by the United States, things like air tankers that
Right.
help keep fighter jets in the air. And if the United States says, you know what, we're not providing that capability anymore, well, then it's on Europe to provide it and Canada to provide it, and a lot of those capabilities just don't exist, and they have to go. You have to go buy them, and that takes a very long time. So it's that aspect of the United States simply pulling back what it has committed to the NATO alliance, I think, could be incredibly disruptive and leave European security quite exposed.
Ukraine is obviously not part of NATO, otherwise Article 5 would have been triggered, but the war is being financed and supported by NATO. Let's face it, the defense of Ukraine is essentially being done through that. We saw reporting yesterday that Mike Johnson, in his quest to remain a speaker, assured people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, no more aid for Ukraine. Donald Trump promises to end the war within 24 hours of becoming president. I mean, what does the full control of the apparatus of the state in the United States by Trump mean for Volodymyr Zelensky and his people?
So this is where I'm unfortunately quite pessimistic. I do not think that the United States is going to be able to end the war on day one. And the fundamental reason that we're not going to be able to is because Russia is winning the war. And if you're Vladimir Putin and you are asked to stop fighting when you think that you are going to win and that U.S. support, as you mentioned, won't be there for Ukraine in hard military support, won't be there for Ukraine, then you're going to fight on. And so the notion that Russia will stop on day one and agree to a ceasefire, which I think right now would be in Ukraine's interest, and I could see Ukraine really going for that, I just think is not going to happen. And really the only way I think for Russia to come to the table earnestly will be if the U.S. continues its military support for Ukraine, which means going to Congress, which means the Trump administration going to Congress and asking for another massive, perhaps $50 to $60 billion aid package for Ukraine. And it's Donald Trump is not enthusiastic about that, and neither are many Republicans. So I am very pessimistic that that aid will be there, and then I just don't see how Russia comes to the table in any earnest way to end the war when they think they're going to win it.
No, even like Marco Rubio has said, you know, there should be a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia, but ideally Ukraine would do that from a position of strength. But the way the MAGA movement has evolved and sees, you know, Donald Trump Jr. tweeting pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky and calling him a grifter as if he's personally making money from the war, it doesn't bode well. You know, for the future commitments there. So I wonder just your thoughts, Max Bergmann, on some of the people that Donald Trump is picking to fill out some of these key roles. I mean, Marco Rubio, fairly conventional Republican, multi-term senator, seems like as close to a mainstream pick probably as we've seen, but Pete Hegseth as defense secretary, you called that shocking. He comes from the Fox and Friends couch. And Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence. What are your thoughts on what that means for the direction of the Trump administration?
Well, I think the early announcements of Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz as the national security advisor, I think, were greeted with sighs of relief in Kyiv. And Marco Rubio, you could have seen in any Republican administration, I think, going back to World War II. So I think, you know, he brings a degree of experience, having been in the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's a China hawk, but before being a China hawk, he was a Russia hawk. Right. And I think very much sees Vladimir Putin quite clear-eyed. But then you look at other appointments. Someone like Pete Hegseth just doesn't have a lot of experience. That may be fine, but you know, the Pentagon is one of the largest bureaucracies in the world. It's an incredibly complicated place, and so I think many in the Department of Defense are quite nervous about this appointment and what it could mean for U.S. national security. And then I think someone like Tulsi Gabbard, appointment as director of national intelligence was really even more shocking to many here in Washington, but I think in Europe, where you know, her past comments have really resembled the viewpoints of many autocrats, particularly those from Russia, particularly her comments about Syria, her statements early on about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, sort of blaming the Ukrainians. obviously that's going to be created with a lot of concern, not just in Ukraine, but amongst U.S. allies that we share intelligence with. Now, if you're going to share intelligence with us and you don't necessarily trust the director of national intelligence and where she's coming from, I think that's really dangerous. And I think one other aspect of U.S. support for Ukraine is our intelligence sharing, which has been absolutely critical. We have clear insights into what's happening inside of Russia that was evident prior to the war. And I think this really endangers it. And if you're someone working undercover for the United States inside of Russia or an asset for the United States inside of Russia or another country, I think you're somewhat nervous about having Tulsi Gabbard as the director of national intelligence. But we shall see, though, we're going to have to go through a confirmation process.
Yeah, the Senate has some important work ahead of it. I mean, she has said things about biolabs in Ukraine, about NATO expansion causing the war, and it is rightfully, I think, making a lot of people nervous there. Max Bergmann, it was good to have you on the show. Thanks for being here. We'll hope you come back down the road. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.